Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Jonathan Movroydis. Welcome to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. Allow me to introduce our distinguished speaker today. He's one of America's most respected and perceptive China watchers. Dr. Graham Allison is the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government and Director of Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School of Government. Among other accomplishments, Dr. Allison is the founding dean of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and has advised every Secretary of Defense from the Reagan administration to the Obama administration. He's also served as a senior advisor to Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger and Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy and Plans during the Clinton administration. He's the best-selling author of several books, including Lee Kuan Yew, the Grand Master's Insights on China, the United States, and the World, and a new and very influential book which he'll speak about today, and he'll sign copies which are available in our store for purchase. It's called Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? The book has been hailed by several people who have taken the stage, including Dr. Henry Kissinger and Neil Ferguson, and also by General David Petraeus, who will be here on November 28th. So I suggest you check out, look for tickets at nixonfoundation.org. Before we start our event, we thought it would be appropriate to hear from President Nixon regarding China, which is related very much to the premise of this book.
If anybody would read my article in Foreign Affairs and other statements I've made prior to and since that initiative was undertaken, they would note that I always come through with this theme. Even if there were no Soviet Union, it was essential that the United States move now, and move when it did, I should say, in rapprochement with China. And the reason for that is fundamentally that 1/4 of all the people in the world live in the People's Republic of China. It has enormous natural resources. And the Chinese people, as Chinese, are among the most capable people in the world. Look what they've done in Taiwan. Look what in non-communist areas, in Taiwan and Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, San Francisco, you name it. And once that power is mobilized, it is going to be an enormous force in the world, for good or for bad. I think de Gaulle hit it in his usual way in 1969 most effectively when he said cryptically, better for you to recognize China now when they need you than to wait until later when their power is such that you will need them. And so in order to build the kind of a world that we want our grandchildren to live in the 21st century, it was essential that the United States, the most powerful and prosperous in the free world, have a new relationship with the People's Republic of China. And finally, I would say for some of those who object to that initiative, if it had not been undertaken, and if China, due to the fact that they did not have any guarantee of their security from the United States vis-a-vis the Soviet, had been forced back under the Soviet umbrella, the geopolitical relationship and balance in the world would be almost hopelessly against us at this time. It was necessary to do for that reason, but apart from that, it was essential to do for the next century.
Nixon commenting on the next century that engaging China was very important. But yet, reading from the cover of your book, it could prove otherwise, destined for war. I'd like to start by asking, just as the basis, who is Thucydides and what is the Thucydides trap, and are the U.S. and China really destined for war?
So first let me say it's a great honor for me to be here, and I appreciate you all coming for the session. And secondly, I think President Nixon's comments, I don't remember when they were made, but are brilliant, as the article was. If you look back at this 1967 Foreign Affairs article, it was really prescient. And his proposition that China is going to be China at some point, and the issue is going to be whether we have a good relationship with them or a bad relationship, also correct. So that's for sure. But let me back up to your question, and then I'll come forward. So first, today, you're having an opportunity to meet a great thinker. I hope it's to reintroduce you to him, but if you haven't been introduced before, to introduce you to him. And his name is Thucydides. So I published this book about 5 months ago, and I've discovered in the interim that many Americans are not familiar with Thucydides. Some even have trouble pronouncing his name. So in unison, 1, 2, 3, we're going to say, 1, 2, 3, Thucydides. One more time, Thucydides. Okay. If you want a fun look at the thucydidestrap.org website, and one of the tabs is Look Who's Talking About Thucydides. Xi Jinping, the president of China, speaks about Thucydides trap often and has trouble pronouncing the name Thucydides, so you can see, and other people. But Thucydides was the father and founder of history. He wrote the first ever history book. That was called The History of the Peloponnesian War, which was the account 2,500 years ago of what happened in classical Greece when Athens, which was becoming one of the pinnacles of civilization, rose to challenge Sparta, which had been the dominant power in Greece for 100 years. So Thucydides is the first person to write a history defined as getting the facts right. What actually happened? What choices did human beings make, and what were the consequences? Without the benefit of any external mythologies or spirits or otherwise. So just the consequences of human beings' choices in difficult conditions. And you can go download for free The History of the Peloponnesian War. Read the first 100 pages. That's book 1. And if every other page doesn't knock your socks off, check your pulse. So this is a big, serious, great thinker who should be part of your mental library. And you'll learn a lot. Every chapter of the book, actually, I have a little quote from Thucydides, because he had many wonderful ideas. In this book, I'm trying to make vivid one of them. So Thucydides' trap, your second question, is the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rising power, like Athens, impacts a ruling power, like Sparta, or a rising power, like Germany, in the decades before 1914, impacts Britain, which has been ruling the world for 100 years at that time. Or China, over the past generation, impacts the U.S., which has been the dominant international power. So when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, in general, poop happens. So in this book, I look at the last 500 years of history. I find 16 cases, 1-6, in which a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. 12 of the cases end in war. 4 of the cases end in not war. So to your final, you get 3 questions here. The third question is, can America and China escape Thucydides' trap? That is war between the U.S. and China inevitable or not? And in the book, I say the answer is, like a professor would say, no and yes. Okay? So let me explain. No, it's not possible to escape Thucydides' trap if we insist on business as usual. So business as usual, which is what we've seen for the last 20 years, in this case, will likely produce history as usual. And history as usual would be a catastrophic war that nobody wants, but that happens. But on the other hand, yes, we can escape Thucydides' trap if we take to heart the great insight from Santayana, which is only those who refuse to study history are condemned to repeat it. So there's not an obligation for the U.S. and China to make the same mistakes that Kaiser Wilhelm did in 1914, or even that Pericles made. in the breakdown of the long peace that produced the Peloponnesian War. So if we learn from history, we might do better. And the purpose of the book, therefore, to be clear, is not fatalism about a war between the U.S. and China. Because make no doubt about it, a war between the U.S. and China will be catastrophic for China. And its dream will be vanished. And will be catastrophic for the United States and what we're trying to do with our country. So this is a crazy idea. And nobody in China wants a war with the U.S. Thank goodness. And nobody in the U.S. wants a war with China. But that does not mean that a war can't happen. So the book is about understanding that we're in extremely dangerous conditions as a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, that generally in those circumstances, third parties' actions that neither of us want and that would otherwise be inconsequential can trigger a reaction by one of us that requires a reaction by the other, in which then one thing leads to the other, and pretty soon we're dragged into something that we didn't want. So think, how in the world did the assassination of an archduke in 1914 create a war that burned down the whole house of Europe? I mean, it's incredible. I studied this when I was a student, okay, a graduate student, and wrote an essay about it, and I said, I simply can't understand it. And I've been interested in it since. I have a good chapter in my book on it. And the conclusion is, I don't know how this could happen. This makes no sense. Everybody lost what he cared about most. But each felt obliged to react to something that somebody else did, and one thing led to the other. So the purpose of the book is not fatalism, not pessimism, but to say extremely dangerous conditions require extremely imaginative and adaptive responses. And I think that's actually very consistent with what President Nixon was saying.
Going to this idea of the rising power displacing the established power, at the beginning of your book, you say that China is doing in hours what the United States takes years to do. Can you illustrate the magnitude of what China is capable of accomplishing today?
So for those of you who haven't been watching the China story, who interestingly enough did not include former President Nixon, who up until the end of his life watched China every day. I'll even say something about that just in a second, because as usual, he was very, very thoughtful about what was happening. So if you haven't been watching, you should read the first chapter of the book, which is called The Rise of China. Never before has a country risen so far, so fast, on so many different dimensions. So basically, it's stunning. Just over the past 25 years, a country that was nowhere, I mean, if you take the quote from Nixon, in 1971, China had a lot of people, and they were all poor. They were not really a serious player anywhere. His proposition was if they ever get their act together, this was going to be very impressive because they're extremely talented people. But they've generally had governments that messed them up. Okay? So in any case, in the period since the opening to China, but jump ahead, just the last 25 years, just the last 25 years, China came from nowhere to rival the U.S. and even to surpass us in many domains. I have a quiz I give to my students at Harvard that has 46 indicators. And the title of the chart is called When Could China Become Number One? So largest middle class, largest number of billionaires, largest trading company, biggest producer of smartphones, fastest supercomputers, largest national economy. So I go on down the list, 46. In the book, I have a little short version of the quiz. And students have to write in the answer, 2030, 2040, not in my lifetime. Okay? Then I give them a second chart with the title of the second chart. Already, all these 46 things have already happened. Today, there's more billionaires in China than there is in the U.S. Today, China has, in the contest that's held every year for supercomputers, China won 4 of the top 5 places last year. They didn't even enter the contest 10 years ago. So basically, today, China has the largest national economy. Again, no Americans know this. But if you go to the IMF website or to the CIA website and look at the yardstick, they both agree is the single best yardstick for comparing national economies. China's economy in 2014 became bigger than the American economy. Well, why didn't anybody tell us? Well, the answer is we hadn't been watching. Okay. So to your particular question, in the book I give you an illustration. I'm sorry I didn't bring the slide, but there's a bridge at Harvard that goes across the Charles River between the Kennedy School and the business school. Those of you who know Cambridge will have gone across this. It's called the Anderson Bridge. I can see it out of my office at the Kennedy School. So the renovation of this bridge, the discussion of it began when I was dean. And I quit being dean in 1989. The project began in earnest in 2012. It was a 2-year project. In 2014, they said it's not finished. It's going to take another year. In 2015, they said not yet. It'll be 1 more year. 2016, they said we're not telling you when it's going to be finished. Okay? And it was 3 times over budget. In Beijing, there's a similar bridge. It's called the Sanyan Bridge, S-A-N-Y-A-U-N. You could look it up. Okay? In 2015, the Chinese decided they want to renovate that bridge. It actually has twice as many traffic lanes as the Anderson Bridge at Harvard. How long did it take for the Chinese to renovate this bridge? Let's take a guess. How many years? 20? Okay. 1? What else? Answer, 43 hours. Excuse me, 43 hours. You go to YouTube and look it up, Sanyan Bridge or 43-hour bridge. You'll see the video of it that's speeded up, 43 hours. Okay? Now, I know that's in Cambridge. Well, I mean, in California, for example, you have the only high-speed rail project that the U.S. has been constructing for 10 years. When was that going to be finished? How long is it? 500 miles, LA to San Francisco. When was it to be finished? 2017. I think it's 2017 already. The announcement was recent that it was going to be 2029. And I have some friends who say they don't think they're going to see it in their lifetime. In the same 10 years we've been building this 500 miles, how many miles of high-speed rail has China laid that's operating today? Yes? 16,000. 16,000. You can get on the high-speed rail in Beijing and be in Shanghai in 1 hour and 45 minutes. And before the California 500 miles is finished, how many more miles of high-speed rail in China will be? My bet, if it takes 10 years, another 16,000, maybe more. So basically, if you haven't been looking at China, you should look at it and be astonished. And if you haven't seen China in your face and in your space, either you haven't been looking or just wait.
Going to how that economic growth translates into military capacity. In your book, you make reference to a chart from the Rand Corporation. In every conceivable way, about 20 years ago, the U.S. had military superiority. Today, that when you get closer to the China mainland, you see greater parity between U.S. and China forces, even some advantage to China. With that said, the United States still has, we still have air superiority in terms of technology. We have 20 more, we have a ratio of 20 to 1 in terms of aircraft carriers. What does China's economic advancement, does it translate to military parity or even military superiority in the future?
Okay, it's a very good question. I was over at Rand yesterday wrestling with people about this and related issues. So in the book, I have an illustration of a seesaw as a very simplistic illustration of what happened economically, in which this was something I produced as a cartoon for the Senate Armed Services Committee back in 2014, just to let them see what was happening economically. In 2004, which most of us here can remember, China's GDP was 20% the size of U.S. So I represent this on a seesaw with the U.S. on one end, the size of whatever our GDP, and China on the other end. By 2014, this seesaw has lifted to the point that we're roughly equal. China's a little bit bigger. And by 2024, on the current trend line, China will be 40% larger GDP than the U.S. So the purpose of this was the Senate Armed Services Committee was trying to put in context the debate and discussion about the big initiative of the Obama administration in Asia, which was called what? Remember? The pivot, or sometimes called the rebalance. And what was that about? It was an argument that said, we're putting too much of our weight on our left foot in the Middle East fighting wars when the future is in Asia. So we should lighten up on the left foot so we can put more weight on our right foot. Makes good sense. But I said we weren't noticing that while this debate has been going on, this seesaw has just been lifting both feet off the ground. So basically, economics is not everything, but it's the substructure of power in most dimensions. As China's economic strength has grown, its defense spending has actually grown faster than its economy. So whereas if you go back to 2004, or if you go back to 1996 in the Clinton administration when I was in the Pentagon, China wanted to intimidate Taiwan because there was a movement towards independence in Taiwan. So they conducted a missile test, they called it, essentially bracketing Taiwan to intimidate them. The Clinton administration, President Clinton, decided this is unacceptable, and we moved 2 carriers up into the zone to force China to back down. And the Chinese military found this hugely humiliating, but because they had to back down. They then began a very determined spending program to force our carriers out of that zone. So there's something in naval terms called the first island chain. If you look at the water from the Chinese border out, the first island chain goes from Japan right around to the Philippines. So now they have missiles, very good missiles on the land that can attack and kill American carriers. So the U.S. Navy carriers have now moved out beyond the first island chain. Indeed, but so far out from China that the aircraft on the American carriers cannot fly to attack the Chinese mainland. So basically what the military balance about in their region has been about pushing the U.S. back from their borders, from their adjacent seas, and back, in the first instance, behind the first island chain. At the meeting last week, or no, this week in Beijing, between Xi and President Trump, at one point, President Xi said, you know, we think the Pacific is big enough for both of us. It's a good line. Where do you think he thinks the dividing line should be? And I think he thinks it's maybe Hawaii for now, okay? So we're not challenging your claim to Hawaii. And so you can have Hawaii to the California, but the space on this side is where we want to become predominant. And I think that's their objective, and I think that's actually what's happening on the ground and in the sea.
As you mentioned earlier, you illustrate several case studies in the book, from the Peloponnesian War to World War II to the Franco-Prussian War, in which war might have been inevitable or not have been inevitable. Can you give a case study in how two powers escaped the Thucydides trap?
Okay, good question. So let me just be clear or I'm going to reformulate the question just a little bit. So inevitable, which is a word that Thucydides uses and which then gets replayed too often, I disagree with completely. In fact, I give an account in the book where I believe Thucydides is basically misinterpreted on this point. He does have this famous line, often quoted, that I quote in the book, in which he says, quote, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war inevitable." But if you read it in context, and you read the whole book in Greek, or the language in which it was written, he doesn't mean inevitable 100%. He means very likely. It's like if you say, I'm accused of a crime, and I go before the judge and I say, he made me do it. And the answer is, he created conditions in which you thought you had to do it, but you exercised some choice. So there's always the structure and then the agency. And Thucydides is not about denying agency. He believes that the choices that people made have consequences, and they could have made different choices. So it's not, quote, inevitable in the sense of like 100%. It's like, under these conditions, my options have narrowed, and I have to have more difficult choices. So both in the cases of the 16 cases, the 12 that lead to war, human beings made decisions that had consequences, and they could have made different decisions, but in the Thucydidean dynamic, they find themselves pulled in ways, so they're at risk of making mistaken choices. So if I take a case that led to war, World War I, and contrast that with a case that was successfully navigated, the Cold War, which is called war, but counts in my list as no war, since it was competition in every dimension except bombs and bullets killing each other directly, massively. So in 1914, just to remind you, an archduke is assassinated visiting Sarajevo by a Serbian terrorist. So there's like, you could make this up in a movie script, okay? So the archduke is the successor to the throne in Vienna, which is the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So his father, the emperor, thinks, well, we have to punish these Serbs for doing this, which is appropriate. Everybody agreed. And he begins to punish them. The Russians fear that the Austrians are going to overdo it. So they're going to be too brutal to the Serbians, who are Orthodox, as are the Russians. So the Tsar is supporting the Serbs. The Kaiser in Germany has only one ally, the emperor in Vienna. So he supports him. The French have a military alliance with the Russians. The English have become entangled with the French. So one thing leads to the other, and pretty soon everybody's at war. At the end of the war, what has happened? Every one of the leaders is gone. And every one of the leaders' ambitions have been destroyed. So the Austro-Hungarian emperor, out. Empire, dissolved. Finished. Russian Tsar, he'd been overthrown by the Bolsheviks. His whole regime is gone. Kaiser, out. France, bled of its youth for a whole generation. Society never recovers as a great player. And Britain, which has been a creditor for 100 years, is turned into a debtor. It's on a slow slide for decline. So if you'd given people a chance for a do-over, nobody would have chosen what he did, but they did and it happened. So that's a bad news story. So what happens is dynamic, rising versus ruling, and not that one or the other decides this is a good time for a war, but some third-party action or provocation leads somebody to think they have to do something, to which somebody else feels they have to do something, and one thing leads to the other. Now, take an alternative, a success story. In the Cold War, many people thought, well, the Soviet Union is rising, it's going to rival the U.S., maybe overshadow the U.S., we need to go to war with the Soviet Union. And people think, wait a minute, that's a crazy idea. And especially after the Soviets came to have a nuclear arsenal, this seems insane. So that's on the one hand. We create a great Cold War strategy. I have a good chapter about that in the book that's worth people remembering. This was one of the remarkable achievements ever in the story of statecraft for any country, and especially for the U.S. But 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis. This is agreed by historians to have been the most dangerous episode ever in recorded history. In that episode, John Kennedy took what he thought was a 1 in 3 chance of nuclear war with the Soviet Union that would have killed 100 million people at the time, to prevent the Soviets placing nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. There was this 13-day intense confrontation. Then there was a lot of care and adaptability. I write about that in another book, though I have a little bit about it in this book. You'd have to look to see. But in any case, once the people got focused, and especially Kennedy and Khrushchev, they managed to maneuver in a situation that would have been likely to have dragged them to war if they hadn't been exercising extreme imagination and extreme adaptability. So I think that's a good illustration of where, and then after having lived through this, almost falling off the brink, the two of them decided we better constrain the competition in the Cold War, and the Cold War became to be more regularized in a way that then President Nixon actually participated in creating a set of arms control arrangements that constrain things even further. So I think we should remember that in both of these cases, it's not that the rising power decides, I'm big enough, I should fight you now, or you're thinking, he's getting so big, I better fight him now because he might be stronger tomorrow. It's that under this, or in this dangerous dynamic, some third-party action drags us somewhere where we don't want to be. And if we were doing central casting, I was yesterday with some movie people here in LA, and somebody said, if we were doing central casting, we could not make up Kim Jong-un in North Korea. I mean, that's just he's ready and available, a little rocket man, as President Trump calls it. Yeah.
In chapter 5 of your book, you ask readers to imagine if China were just like us, and you use the case study of Teddy Roosevelt. You write that he called the westward expansion of the United States the crowning and greatest achievement of the English-speaking people's march of civilization over the world's waste spaces. In 1890, the U.S. had no battleships, and by 1905, we had 25 and became the world's leading naval power in just a span of 15 years. And then you continue to say that TR's ambitions didn't end with the end of the Pacific coast. Over a century on, does China, a rapidly growing nation with expanding military capabilities, harbor similar ambitions? And what's their governing philosophy of their foreign policy? And just as a corollary to that question, how does the U.S. view that?
Okay, so as usual, you have about 3 questions here together, so let me parse them and then go through. So I have a delicious chapter, at least I think, chapter 5 that you referred to, but that many Americans will find uncomfortable. So I'm warning you. Teddy Roosevelt is one of my heroes, and always been one of my heroes. But the chapter asks, what if Xi Jinping and his China was just like us? And not just like us as we imagine ourselves to be today, but just like us as we were emerging to claim a century, which Teddy Roosevelt was supremely confident was going to be the American century, or the first American century. So it's 1897, Teddy Roosevelt, 37 years old, and he comes to Washington as the number 2 person in the Department of the Navy. In the decade that follows, what happens? So first, there's a mysterious explosion in Havana Harbor in the main. And we take it as the occasion to declare war on Spain. We liberate Cuba, we take Puerto Rico, and we pick up Guam as a spoil of war. That's how the U.S. came to have Guam. Secondly, we support and sponsor a coup in Colombia and create a whole new country. It's called Panama, which the next day gives us a contract for our canal, which the Colombians wouldn't give us. So Teddy's ships can go from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Next, we threaten war, first with Germany and then with Britain, unless they back off of a territorial dispute in Venezuela. And then the piece that I think is the most delicious, we steal the biggest part of the fat tail of Alaska from the Canadians. You have to read about it. So basically, if you look, Alaska is this big chunk of land, and then there's a tail, a fat tail that goes down about 600 miles that cuts Canada off from the sea. And most of that we stole from the Canadians, fair and square, as Senator Hayakawa once said about the Panama Canal. Okay, so basically, if China should behave like that, then for sure we'll have a war, for sure. Because we're not going to adapt and adjust as agilely as the British did under those circumstances, I think. So what does China want? Again, I have a chapter called What Does China Want? They're pretty explicit about this. And if you listened last week and the week before to the 19th Party Congress in Beijing, he laid out in this 3.5-hour work plan a very explicit question. Is or she and his colleagues serious about displacing the U.S. as the predominant power in the Western Pacific in the foreseeable future? It's a good question. If you read Dr. Kissinger's book on China, 700 pages, it says, on the one hand, on the other hand, it's complicated, okay? So I asked the world's premier China watcher, who was one of my tutors for this book, as well as Henry Kissinger. So this is Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew was the founder and builder of Singapore. He took a little corrupt port when he became head of it, and in one generation brought it to be one of the first world megapolis. That's a wonder. So what is China's ambition? They want to displace the U.S. in Western Asia. I quote in the book, he says, of course, why not? Who could imagine otherwise? How could they not aspire to be the dominant power in Asia in the foreseeable future? And in time, maybe beyond that. So will they succeed? I go through the list of questions there, but are they serious about the notion that China, which in their view and in their history, and this is roughly right, they exaggerate, but still, their history is China was the dominant power in the world for 4,000 or 5,000 years, way before anybody thought of America. We used to dominate everything we could see. And everybody else related to us, the Chinese, as satellites to the sun. We're the sun, everybody revolves around us. Or as tributaries to the emperor. So the relationship between China and everybody else is defined by kowtow, which is you bow to me because I'm the big guy. That's it. And that's the way we relate to each other. So they think, in their story, and I think this is roughly right, about 200 years ago, some Westerners showed up, especially from Europe, with technology. And that became what they call the centuries of humiliation, because we exploited them. Well, yes, we probably did, okay? Westerners. So what was the Opium War about? If you want to, just again, it's hard to believe, okay? It's a war that the British fought mostly with the Chinese. What was it about? It was about the British right to sell opium to Chinese. Oh, that's a fact. So they call that the century of humiliation, and they say, now we're big and strong, that's over. You've been here for a long time, I understand that, but that was then. Now is now, time for you to go. So that's their aspiration. Is the U.S. about to leave the Western Pacific? I don't think so. Could we adapt and adjust in many ways? I hope so. So I don't think it's inevitable that we have to fight about this. But I think under these conditions, it's quite possible that a third party like North Korea, or a third party like Taiwan, or a third party, or an accident, or unintended event in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, or some action by the Japanese with respect to their Senkaku Islands, could produce the spark, like the assassination of the Archduke, in which one thing then leads to the other, and at the end of the day, we find ourselves somewhere where we don't want to be.
Getting back to that incident in the South China Sea, you illustrate in your book that U.S. and Chinese allied warships are at greater proximity than ever before, and that the U.S. Navy regularly sends guided missile destroyers to conduct freedom of navigation operations near the Chinese-controlled islands. You write that a seemingly mundane operation could lead to an incident of grave proportions. Could you explain?
Well, if you have ships and planes in close proximity every day, which we do, and you have the temptation of the people who are the captains of these ships, let's say, to engage in what they call shouldering, and both the U.S. Navy and the Chinese Navy do this. So shouldering means you're coming on this path. So I come on a path that will collide with you unless you move over a little bit. And then the question is, we get closer and closer, which one of us is going to swerve a little bit? And if we fail to swerve, we crash. You should remember that at the beginning of the Bush administration in 2001, a Chinese fighter aircraft crashed into an American spy plane, an EC-131, and the plane collapsed. So the likelihood of accidents when military are operating in close proximity is quite high. The question is then, how does what comes in the next step? You would hope that there's a circuit breaker and people calm down and quiet down, but I sketch in the book, in the chapter From Here to War, the ways in which that could escalate to somewhere where you don't want to be. So, for example, you and I are playing this game, in effect, and I just decide, okay, I'm not swerving, and you decide you're not swerving, so the two ships collide. So a destroyer sinks with several hundred people are killed. The commander of the unit that's operating there may well respond against the other ships in the zone. The aircraft in the area may come to the rescue of one of the other. So you could easily see how one step leads to the other up an escalation ladder. And I mention in the book that if there were such a local conflict, and especially if it was adjacent to some of the islands that the Chinese have built and militarized that they feel strongly about, or if it was close to Taiwan, you could get aircraft and even a carrier operating in the zone. If a carrier were destroyed, were sunk, you're talking about 5,000 or 6,000 Americans that would be killed. So any president's going to respond to that in a fairly substantial way. And then two great new accelerants in the picture that make it possible to slide up the escalation ladder are first satellites and any satellite weaponry. So the U.S. in particular has an asymmetric vulnerability with respect to satellites because we use these big, expensive military satellites for everything. They produce our intelligence, so that's how we know where targets are. They produce our intelligence, so we know what's going on in the region. They produce our ISR, which is our surveillance and reconnaissance, without which we can't operate our military systems. They are connected in a web to the offensive systems. And they do our command and control. So actually, absent the satellites, it's pretty hard for the two ships to talk to each other. Actually, we're now practicing using signals, which people used to do before there was, before there were electronics. So you could have the U.S. with no eyes and ears early in the campaign, and certainly the Chinese war planners think about that a lot. And then the question is, well, do you want to keep going forward or do you want to stop now? Similarly, cyber produces another new accelerant. So if a Chinese missile on the Chinese homeland were launched and struck an American carrier and sunk it, American SOPs call for attacking whatever offensive capability struck us. So we would then attack the American homeland, the Chinese homeland, wherever these batteries of missiles are. So now, and we're way away from, we're the other side of the world. So traditionally you would say, well, it'll be a local war. But what's the likelihood that the Chinese let us strike their mainland and don't do something on our mainland? And I think the answer's not very likely. So what could they do? So a cyber attack that basically took down the electrical grid, well, without electricity, Americans have become pretty unhappy pretty fast. So you could see how that, and then you hope that it stops at some point and people say, wait a minute, this is an escalation ladder we don't want to play. So we need to stop now, but it could easily accelerate to something that would be a full-scale war between the U.S. and China. And if that were to happen, God help us, yeah.
Moving on to the 19th Party Congress, recently in the news, President Xi, it's been reported that he has emerged from that event more powerful than ever. Probably, they say he might rule beyond 2020. He said in his speech at the Congress that he envisioned China to be a modern socialist strong power by 2035. What does he mean by that?
So, good. So for those of you who weren't watching carefully, and I'm sure and hope that you didn't try to listen to this 3.5-hour work plan speech, which is a mouthful and was done in the elaborate form of Chinese ritual. But if you look at it and study it, it's very instructive. So what happened last week and the beginning of this week basically, in a word, we saw this wasn't just Xi Jinping being reelected for a second 5-year term as president. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal the week before the Party Congress in which I said, watch for the coronation of the new 21st century emperor of China. So Xi Jinping is now the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao. His thought has been written into the Constitution. So if you're a Chinese party member, you have to study his thought and take its guidance, or else you fight the party, and that'll be bad for you. Okay? He very conspicuously has no plausible successor. So in the tradition, the Standing Committee, which is the next group with which the president shares power, includes somebody who would be the successor. And he's trained up over the 5 years of the second term of the last guy, the way Xi was. This one includes nobody who could take that role. So the presumption is that Xi's going to rule well beyond the end of his next 5-year term. So his next 5-year term starts in 2018 and ends in 2023 or 4, okay? But beyond. So he has announced he is very, very powerful and also very ambitious, but also very confident. Almost as I write in the book, Napoleonic style confidence. So there's a saying among politicians, which is, if you want to survive, never state a target number as an objective and a date in the same sentence. It's perfectly fine to say we're going to reduce our carbon emissions by 90%, but don't say when. And it's okay to say something's going to happen in 2025, but don't say what. But don't put those two things in the same sentence. That's what most politicians do if you listen. If you listen carefully. He is perfectly prepared to say. He said earlier, in 2021, the GDP of China will have doubled in the period between 2010 and 2020. Actually, they already have achieved that objective. He then enunciated several months ago, China, it's called Made in China 2025. So by 2025, he identified 10 industries that China is going to dominate. So that's self-driving cars, artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing. So all the modern industries, China is not just going to be participating, it wants to dominate those industries by 2025. By 2035, they want to be the dominant source of innovation in the world, just what you were saying. And 2049 is the big target. 2049 is the 100th anniversary of the creation of the the People's Republic of China. And by then, they want to be the biggest, strongest country in the world. And that's their work plan.
This month, President Trump made a widely publicized five-nation tour of Asia. And the operative words he used were five-nation tour. He told delegates at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum in Da Nang, Vietnam, that he had the honor of sharing our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific region. Do you think that the Trump administration has given a clear indication of what their Asia policy will be?
So in a word, no. Okay. So basically, this trip was initially about the president showing up in Asia. And this was a marathon trip, 5 countries, 10 days. That's a lot of travel, even if you have Air Force One. But the principal objective in this trip was North Korea. So basically, I don't know how vividly the members of the audience have been watching this, but by this time next year, so if we have the good fortune to meet this time next year, one of 3 things is going to have happened. 1, North Korea, Kim Jong-un will have completed the set of ICBM tests that he has been conducting and that he was about to complete last month, but stopped and paused for a little bit. That will give him a credible capability to strike Los Angeles or San Francisco with a nuclear warhead. So let me say it again. A year from today, one possibility of the 3 is that Kim Jong-un has what CAA will call a credible threat to strike Los Angeles with a nuclear weapon. Option 2, President Trump will have attacked North Korea to prevent that happening. And option 3, there'll be a minor miracle. So I'm praying for option 3. If I were making my bets, I wrote a piece actually last week in Politico, if you want to go look it up, in which I would say the most likely outcome is the first one, that Kim Jong-un wins. That's not a very good world to live in, but as Steve Bannon said when he was doing his exit interview from the White House, if you look at the realities by the time Trump got there, he's got us. So there's logic in that. But option 2, I think, is the next most likely. And I would make it at least 25%, 20 or 25%. Because President Trump has said he is not going to let Kim Jong-un have a capability to strike the American homeland with nuclear weapons. This is crazy. I mean, it makes no sense. So he told Xi Jinping, first at Mar-a-Lago when he met him, when he invited him for the first meeting in April, and now last week when they met, he said, I'm telling you, and I told you as clearly as I could, you can stop this guy. And you have to stop this guy. Because if you don't stop this guy, I will stop him. And you're not going to like the way I do it. Actually, at Mar-a-Lago, he then served him chocolate cake for the opening dinner. Said, I got to go next door for a second. He went next to the room next door and announced that the U.S. was just launching cruise missiles against Syria, just to kind of make the point, if you have an idea, how could we do this? So the purpose and point of this whole trip, I mean, the centerpiece was North Korea and trying to get the other pieces in place, but the dominant piece being Xi, and getting Xi to act to stop Kim Jong-un. So Xi has always said, we can't do this. And Trump tells him, you can do this. This is not that hard. And actually, he said to him, you could, if you watch the language Trump used, it's very interesting. He said, he started off and he said, you are an extraordinary individual. So that's showing great respect. And then he said to him, you are a strong man. Then he said, this is not hard to stop this guy. This is easy. And then he said, this fellow, I know him, President Xi. When he puts his mind on something and works on it, he solves the problem. So he has him set up there. Xi says, whenever he's talking in public, he says, I can't solve this problem. Nobody has solved this problem for all these years. Now you're coming to me? And I think that's the Chinese position that they've taken. But in fact, I believe, and I think Trump's right about this, if Xi squeezes the oil lifeline that Kim Jong-un is dependent upon, he'll get his attention. And maybe can cause them to stop for now. Not forever, to start with, but how about for a year? No ICBM tests for a year. No nuclear tests for a year. That's my minor miracle. That's not the end of the story. It's not to solve everything. It only is for a year to start with. But if we were able to do this for a year to start with, and especially if Trump and Xi had done this together, then they'll think of maybe if they did a minor miracle or helped produce a minor miracle, they can do more things. So that'd be my, of the three options, I think that's the least likely, but I think that's the most that I can hope for. Yeah.
Can I ask?
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Please.
Please.
I came here to ask this question.
Please.
And you moved right into it. Do you think, and I agree with everything you said about Trump having set this meeting up with those 5 leaders, I think she is going to be the fall guy, incidentally. I think that will be, he'll be, if he doesn't act according to the plan. But anyway, the point is, I think would Trump say, look, we'll leave you alone on the South Island acquisitions if you will clean up this mess in North Korea?
So in the piece that I wrote in Politico, which you should go, please just download it, you can read it, I talk about the minor miracle, as I call it. So the minor miracle would be that in their private meeting, all the public ceremonies for the trip were fine. Everything worked fine. But that's the, ceremonies and pomp and ceremony and words, that's the show. Behind the scenes, people either do business or they don't do business. And since it's behind the scenes, you and I don't know what happened. Okay, so I have no idea what they did when they were meeting in private. But if I were hoping, in private, they sat down and they said, look, this jerk, whom neither of us like, I mean, Xi Jinping calls Kim Jong-un little fatty. He does not care about this guy at all, at all. If he could strangle him, he would, okay? So they say, this guy is going to pull us somewhere where we don't want to go. He could have you and me in a war. This would be insane. So let us figure out what we can do. Okay, so I then think, what can you do? I don't know. What can you do? I don't know. Here, I got an idea. Let's each pick 1 or 2 people that we trust. So I'm Trump. I say, here's Mattis and somebody else, and you pick 2 people and tell them go off in a corner or in another room. 3 days, 2 days, not more. They have to come back with 3 solutions. Each one of those we're not going to like. Because they're going to involve me having to do something I don't want to do, and you having to do something you don't want to do. But that's okay. They only have to be better than what we now have. They don't have to be good, just better. So one of those options would come back and it would say, look, if you can fix this, we're going to do this. Now, what could that involve? Well, could we adjust the military exercises we do in Korea? The Pentagon says, no, we can't possibly do that. Of course we can. Can we adjust the arms sales we make to Taiwan? No, we do that because of course we can. Can we be more aggressive or less aggressive in what's happening in the South China Sea? No, we're not going to let our Navy be determined by whatever the Chinese. Of course we can. Now, all those involve compromises, and it would be criticized. So there's none of these are things that we would do otherwise, but they may be things we would do if we were forced to try to think about what are better options than the one we're now watching play out. So I would say yes.
Final question. We'll get to your questions. You talked a little bit about President Xi and President Trump, and you couldn't have asked for a better story from central casting. You actually say that in your book. You make a couple of points in your book. You say that both Trump and Xi are driven by common ambition for their countries. They identify the nation ruled by the other as an obstacle to their dream. They take pride in their own leadership capabilities. They see themselves in a central role in revitalizing their nation. They have announced daunting domestic agendas with radical changes. They've fired up populist national support and to drain the swamp of corruption in their country. What do you think the relationship holds in store for both of these gentlemen?
Okay, that's a good question. So this book was 5 years in the making. Thucydides did not have Trump or Xi Jinping in mind. Okay, so the storyline of this book and the analysis of the book is not about Trump or Xi. This is about something fundamental that's happening in the real world, independent of them. It just so happens that now we have Xi as the leader of the rising power and Trump as the leader of the ruling power. I think, again, if Thucydides was here, he would say, this is exactly what I would expect. And they both look like people that we might have chosen to play their role, especially if things were going to go bad. Especially if things were going to go bad. Xi is I would say, the most remarkable leader on the international stage today. He's established himself as the unipolar leader of China. So they used to have a collective leadership. He's taken everything into his own hands. Chinese say, you guys talk about CEOs. We have the COE. The COE is the chief of everything. So every line runs to Xi. He now has consolidated his position, as I say, virtually as the new emperor. And long before Trump talked about making America great again, in 2012, when Xi became president, he unfurled his banner for China. And it's called, colloquially, Make China Great Again. It's called the Great Rejuvenation of the Great Chinese People. That's the words. Okay? So, and it is the case that they could each see each other as the obstacle, or the other's country as the obstacle to achieving what they want. The Chinese see us in their face. If you look at Trump's campaign, China was the villain. So now comes North Korea. I'd say to Trump's credit, he at least has got it that something terrible is going to happen in the next year on the North Korean story. I mean, none of the outcomes is going to be a good outcome, but two of them are going to be very bad. One is we're going to attack him, and then he's probably going to attack Seoul, and then we're probably going to have a second Korean War. And the Secretary Mattis has testified 3 times. Each time before Congress, he says, this war will be catastrophic. Don't think of this like the Iraq War or something like that. Think of tens or hundreds of thousands of Americans getting killed in such a war. That's what we're talking about. So in the first Korean War, tens of thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Chinese and millions of Koreans were killed. So that's what happened in 1950. And most of the Chinese were killed by Americans, and most of the Americans were killed by Chinese. So we already had a war once before there. So don't be under any illusions. This is a terrible, terrible, terrible outcome. Now, is it better than having Kim Jong-un with nuclear weapons that he can deliver against San Francisco and Los Angeles, and in time against Washington? You know, damned if you do, damned if you don't. These are 2 very bad outcomes. And I think most of us would choose not war because war is so horrific. But we shouldn't have any illusions about the first option. It's not a very good option either, which is why, again, the third option of China and the U.S. working together somehow is the crucial one. Is it possible? I mean, both of these folks have been historically underestimated. Xi Jinping rose quietly, in effect in disguise. He was chosen to be president of China by a group who thought he was just going to be the spokesman for the standing committee. And lo and behold, pretty soon he had taken control of everything. Trump is the wildest wild card that we've seen as an American president, at least in recent memory. But I think is frequently underestimated for the fact that, look, this guy did beat Hillary Clinton. And before that, he beat all of the Republican stalwarts to get the nomination. And before that, he created and ran an extremely successful reality TV show, which is, sorry, that's a very competitive business. Ask Arnold Schwarzenegger. He inherited the program from him. He's a great actor, politician, and he couldn't make it work. So, you know, again, whether being a reality TV star and producer is good training for being president, that's another subject. But this is a person that has got some savvy and wile that he's not generally, I think, that not generally appreciated. So, and he wants to do a good job as president. He wants to make America great. So a war with China is not the way to do that, you can be sure. And certainly Mattis and McMaster, his national security advisor, tell him, Mr. President, a war would be catastrophic. So could he become inventive? You know, maybe. So I would say, I'm still in the hopeful camp, even though I appreciate that that's not the most likely.
Dr. Allison has agreed to answer some of your questions.
Or to try.
First question right here.
Do you think that the Chinese president has the power to control the Koreans if he felt it was in his best interest?
So the answer again is yes and no, and let me then be specific. So, can he simply tell the North Koreans or Kim Jong-un, do this, do that, and they'll do it? No. Is the relationship between the two extremely strained? Yes. No love lost by either of them. As I say, she calls him little fatty. These two people have never spoken in 5 years. No person from Xi has gone and seen Kim Jong-un. He sent 3 or 4 emissaries, and when they get there, he doesn't see them. Kim Jong-un has tried to visit China, which is, he knows China is bigger than he is and is the big guy. He's tried to visit there 2 or 3 times. Each time they haven't let him come. So this is a stress relationship on the one hand. So it's not kind of like I just give you a command and you do something. On the other hand, if the oil that comes from North Korea to Pyongyang in this one oil pipeline is reduced, 90% of all the oil comes from there. The oil runs their planes, their tanks, their trucks, their cars, their industry, everything. So this will get their attention. Once before, in 2006, the Chinese had a, quote, interruption, they called it. It was a technical thing, they said. But it was at a very critical moment for 36 hours where the oil, they said, there was a problem and it's not. Kim Jong-un's father jumped to attention, became very agreeable. So I think, yes, that if they were determined to do this, they could get him to stop testing something limited. Now, if you said, how about, can he get him to eliminate all of his nuclear weapons? I don't think so. I think being realistic, I don't think so. If I were Kim Jong-un's advisor, I would say, don't even think about it. You can talk and say, maybe in the long run and whatever. So we're going to be dealing with this as a hard, complicated problem for a long time to come. But I still think the difference between the North Korea that does not have the capability to strike the American homeland with nuclear weapons and the one that does is a difference worth working very hard to achieve. Yeah.
Next question, front row. Oh, over here.
About 6-8 years ago, I was in a meeting such as this, and Tony Blair was the speaker, and he spoke for about 45 minutes about world affairs. He was not prime minister at the time. And then the Q&A came, and the question, his very first question, he had not mentioned China in his entire talk. And the first question came up, what about China? And he said, well, I don't know if I should worry about them a little bit or if I should worry about them a lot. What do you think the Prime Minister would say today?
I would say that his answer has been, his question has been answered. I'll even give you a Nixon line, which I have in the book. So President Nixon was the crucial actor in the opening to China. Kissinger, one of my mentors, was his closest associate, and Kissinger did most of the operational work, but the impulse came from Nixon. It was in an article even before he became president, so, excuse me, he had this idea for a long time. He explained the reasons why. I think he is also correct. That was crucial in ultimately the defeat of the evil empire in the Cold War, absolutely. But after the end of the Cold War, after the Soviet Union disappeared, the U.S. just continued trying to build a bigger, stronger China. So Nixon, the last year of his life, had his colleague and friend and speechwriter, Bill Sapphire, to come talk to him. And he said, Sapphire, do you think maybe we created a Frankenstein in China? So he was already thinking, hey, now wait a minute, these guys are going to be big and strong, and yes, we would like to have been nice to them when they were, but look and see how big and strong they are, and look and see what they want to do, and is this going to be compatible with our own vision? So I would say it's a good question.
Thank you very much. I have a question. As you introduced in your book, that the Thucydides trap have created this structural threat between the U.S. and China. And my question is that how much of this structural threat do you think comes from the fact that China is catching up, and how much of them are just like miscommunication, misconceptions between the two powers, as you argue at the end of your book? And does ideological difference also play a role in this? Thank you much.
Thank you. Very good question. So Thucydides' proposition is about the structural realities And I think the structural realities in this case are the dominant storyline. So basically, it is the case that China is getting bigger and stronger relative to the U.S. It is the case, whatever anybody perceives or doesn't perceive, this seesaw is shifting. And it is the case that China is building up its military capabilities to be able to push the American Navy and American military forces back from its borders, just in a very normal fashion. And it is the case that the Americans believe, I believe, that the order that the U.S. created in Asia in the aftermath of World War II, both the economic and the security order, was the best thing that ever happened to Asia in all of its history. So that created the environment for all of the Asian miracles. And nobody benefited more from this than China. So I've given speeches when I was in the government to Chinese to say, wait, you folks should be appreciative of this. You would not have grown up to be big and strong, but for what we did in providing this order. And actually, you should support it. You should even help pay for it. Yeah. And Chinese say, well, even if I agreed with you, and I think the serious Chinese understand it's true. I mean, the U.S. did create this order. This order has been the best thing for Asia in all of its history in terms of people's economic growth and their freedom. But Chinese say, well, okay, thank you very much. That was then. Now is now. We're here now. So, but out. Okay? So I would say that's the structural reality. Now, secondly, Thucydides would say, in these conditions, where I know what you're really about is trying to displace me, and you know that what I'm really about is trying to constrain you, misperceptions magnify and multiply. So then, even when you're trying to be helpful, I suspect that you have an ulterior motive, so I don't really believe it. And when I'm trying to be helpful, you don't really believe it. So that, if you imagine the conversation between Xi and Trump, or between their advisors, do they believe what each other is saying? Do they believe what each other is suggesting? I was in Beijing about 8 weeks ago. I said, China, since Xi Jinping talks about Thucydides' trap a lot, all of the policy community is abuzz with the topic. And I'm talking to a Chinese security official that I know for a long time. And he says, to tell the truth, there would be no problem on the Korean Peninsula, except that you're there. I said, sorry? Kim Jong-un is the problem. He said, no, look at it. If the Americans were not there, this problem would not exist. So I said, well, tell me, how do you make this out? He says, if you weren't there, there would be a unified Korea. And it would have a government that would be a tributary of ours. And we wouldn't let it have nuclear weapons any more than we would let Vietnam or Myanmar or somebody have nuclear. Of course we wouldn't let somebody have nuclear weapons. What state in our territory. So you're the problem. So I said, well, thank you. I appreciate that view, but let me tell you my story. My story is we didn't volunteer to be in Korea. Your ally, North Korea, attacked South Korea in 1950. We came to the rescue at the last minute. They almost captured the whole peninsula. We pushed the North Koreans right back up the peninsula. Maybe we were a little exuberant, and so we went across the 38th parallel. We were approaching your border. You came and attacked us. That was a tragedy. We ended up having to settle at the armistice at the back of the 38th parallel. But then look and see what happened in the last 60 years. Our guy is one of the wonders of the world. And your guy is one of the armpits of the world. So South Korea is one of the most successful countries in the last 60 years. It's a market economy. It's the 13th largest economy in the world. It's a vibrant democracy. We're very proud of South Korea. And North Korea is a good example of what happens in a communist totalitarian, nut house. And he said, well, That's the problem. So,
Any other questions?
Right here.
You talked about the inevitability if things continue business as usual. So what is not doing business as usual? What should we do different?
okay, good question, very good question. So, I was testifying to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on whatever it was, Tuesday or Wednesday in D.C. And I said about the book, and I said, this book will be very frustrating for Washingtonians especially, because in Washington today, the template says you have to propose a solution in the same sentence in which you identify the problem. And I said, in my view, that's one of our problems. So this book is about diagnosis. Let's get the facts of the situation or the analysis of the situation that we face, the structural conditions right. And that's the primary and overriding objective here, not to propose a solution. In fact, and then in the conclusion I say, I don't think there is a fix for this problem, or there's a, quote, new strategy that if we just did this and did that, the problem goes away. I think we should think of this like a condition, like a chronic condition that we're going to have to cope with for a generation. So, but then in the final chapter I say, but in any case, therefore what? Just your question. And I say, extreme conditions of danger require extreme responses, including in particular extreme imagination and extreme adaptability. And I hope that we can learn the lessons from both the failures and the successes to stimulate that process. So I have a next to last chapter is called 12 Clues for Peace that are extracted from the successes as well as the failures. But just to be very specific, I think what we now need is a real burst of strategic imagination in addressing the problem. And I'm hoping that the book will contribute to that process, in which we'll start thinking of things way beyond the orthodox solution that we've been accustomed to with China, way beyond the box, in effect. And we should think of things far to the left of anything that's currently in the public debate, and far to the right of anything. So I actually sketch a little spectrum and say, here's something that'll scare you to death on the left, and here's something that'll scare you to death on the right. And I'm not recommending either one of those, because I don't know what the answer is, but I think we should be thinking that far out, not just doing what we've been doing. And if this then seems, well, oh my God, that's too hard, we can't do that, I remind us that this is exactly what we did in creating the Cold War strategy. And that was one of the great, great moments of statecraft ever, of anybody. Certainly of us, but of anybody historically. So just to give you remind you of the footnote, in April of 1946, so this is just 1 year after the end of World War II, George Kennan, who was ambassador in Moscow, writes back something that historians know as the so-called long telegram. And this is a brilliant piece of analysis that says the Soviet Union will now pose a larger existential threat to America, the U.S., than the Nazis did. This is April of 1946. So Truman reads this and he says, this person must be out of his mind. We just got through World War II. We just defeated the Nazis and the Japanese. We're exhausted. We're bringing the troops home. We've stretched ourselves further than we can stretch ourselves. We're going to even try to have health care. And we're going to try to get well at home. So don't anybody tell me about this kind of stuff. Go away. Yeah. But this started a conversation. And within 4 years, we had invented the most amazing strategy ever imagined. So we built the IMF and the World Bank and the global trading system with GATT, the global economic order. Truman had the Marshall Plan in 1947. Imagine somebody giving a speech 2 years after the war and saying, I got another good idea. Why don't we tax people for 1.5% of our whole GDP per year for 3 years and send it to these Europeans, including Germans who were just killing us. You're crazy. Nobody's going to do this. NATO, we create an alliance. George Washington told us, stay away from alliances. They get you in trouble. Article 5 of NATO says an attack on one is an attack on all. We rebuild the American military, a standing military, where before, we usually had wars and then we went away and we come back. So basically, there's a political dimension. The whole thing was really, if anybody had proposed the whole Cold War strategy that emerges by 1950, so it's a 3 or 4 year conversation that we get there, in 1947, they would be put in an asylum. Okay, you would say that's completely crazy. So I would say we should now hope as a society, and especially for the younger people here, this is a conversation that younger people are going to make real contributions to, because we should start thinking about things that are, at first blush, seem slightly crazy. That's okay. They may not, we can debate them, we can discuss them, we're not going to do anything, quickly. So I think that the task is really for a surge of imagination.
Thank you, Dr. Allison, for this fascinating talk. Please give Dr. Allison a round of applause. As I said earlier, Dr. Allison will be available in the lobby to sign your copy of Destined for War. You can pick them up in the museum store. Thank you again.
I hope you read it and like it. Thank you. Good. Thank you. Good questions.